The rain in East Harlem does not wash things clean. It only drives the grit deeper into the pavement, turning the avenues into slick black mirrors that reflect the neon signs of bars where men drink to forget what is coming. It was 3 in the morning, a Tuesday in November, the kind of hour when the city usually holds its breath. But on 116th Street, there was no silence. There was a vibration, a low, humming tension that you could feel in your teeth. Inside the back room of a storefront that officially sold cigars but traded in information, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson sat alone. The room was dark, save for the ember of a cigarette that he wasn't smoking, just letting it burn down in the heavy glass ashtray. The air smelled of stale smoke and old leather. On the table in front of him lay a single object. Not a gun, not a knife, a telephone. He was waiting. 10 blocks away, in a restaurant whose blinds were drawn tight, 5 men in expensive suits were arguing. They were shouting in a dialect that mixed Sicilian dialect with the harsh, clipped rhythm of New York streets. They were powerful men, men who could lift a finger and make a union strike, or nod a head and make a judge forget a sentence. But tonight they were sweating, they were pacing, because they had made a mistake, a calculation error. They had assumed that power was simply a matter of volume, of how many soldiers you could put on a corner, how many windows you could smash. They had moved on Harlem 3 days ago. A coordinated push, a muscular attempt to swallow the numbers racket whole, to push the black leadership out and install their own lieutenants. They expected resistance. They expected a shootout. They expected noise. What they got was silence. And then, systematically, one by one, their supply lines had simply stopped. The trucks carrying the liquor for their clubs didn't arrive. The payoffs to the precinct captains were returned, unopened. The girls who ran the books in the tenements simply vanished, not dead, just gone, taking the paper trails with them. The Italians were fighting a ghost. They were punching at smoke. The phone in the dark room on 116th Street remained silent. Bumpy watched the smoke curl up from the ashtray. He checked his watch, 3:02 a.m. He knew exactly what was happening in that restaurant 10 blocks away. He knew which capo was screaming, and he knew which underboss was quietly realizing that they had lost before they had even begun. He didn't need to be there. He had already placed his pieces on the board days ago. Now he was just waiting for them to realize it was checkmate. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Most history books will tell you about the violence. They will show you the mugshots and the headlines about gang wars. They will sell you the idea that the relationship between Harlem and the Italian mob was purely one of bloodshed, of turf skirmishes fought with Tommy guns and tire irons. They write it that way because it is simple. It is easy to understand. They had moved on Harlem 3 days ago. A coordinated push, a muscular attempt to swallow the numbers racket whole, to push the black leadership out and install their own lieutenants. They expected resistance. They expected a shootout. They expected noise. What they got was silence. And then, systematically, one by one, their supply lines had simply stopped. The trucks carrying the liquor for their clubs didn't arrive. The payoffs to the precinct captains were returned, unopened. The girls who ran the books in the tenements simply vanished, not dead, just gone, taking the paper trails with them. The Italians were fighting a ghost. They were punching at smoke. The phone in the dark room on 116th Street remained silent. Bumpy watched the smoke curl up from the ashtray. He checked his watch, 3:02 a.m. He knew exactly what was happening in that restaurant 10 blocks away. He knew which capo was screaming, and he knew which underboss was quietly realizing that they had lost before they had even begun. He didn't need to be there. He had already placed his pieces on the board days ago. Now he was just waiting for them to realize it was checkmate. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Most history books will tell you about the violence. They will show you the mugshots and the headlines about gang wars. They will sell you the idea that the relationship between Harlem and the Italian mob was purely one of bloodshed, of turf skirmishes fought with Tommy guns and tire irons. They write it that way because it is simple. It is easy to understand. But the files, the real files, the ones buried deep in the memories of the old-timers and the redacted FBI memos, tell a different story. They tell the story of a war that wasn't fought on the pavement, but in the mind. A war where the main weapon wasn't a caliber, but psychology. The truth is, Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive the Italian Mafia. He didn't just fight them to a standstill. He analyzed them. He deconstructed their hierarchy, understood their vanity, and used their own weight against them. He knew something they refused to believe, that in the underworld, the man who controls the chaos is more powerful than the man who creates it. This isn't a story about a gangster. It's a story about a grand master. To understand the end game, you have to understand the board. And the board was Harlem in the late 1940s, a city within a city. To the outsider, it was a place of jazz and poverty, a vibrant culture and desperate struggle. But to Bumpy, it was a living organism. He knew the pulse of every block. He knew which grandmother watched the window on 125th Street, and he knew which police officer was behind on his gambling debts. But this knowledge came with a heavy cost. Before he was the king, he was a man walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. You have to imagine the pressure. Every day he walked streets where a wrong look could spark a riot. He wasn't just protecting a business, he was holding up a canopy over a community that the rest of the world wanted to crush. He felt the weight of it in his chest, a constant tightening knot. He knew that if he showed weakness, the wolves from downtown would come in and tear everything apart. If he showed too much aggression, the police would lock the neighborhood down and starve his people out. He had to be something else, something contradictory. He had to be a wall and a door at the same time. There were nights he couldn't sleep, pacing the floor of his apartment, listening to the city breathe. He would read history, Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, the histories of Rome. He wasn't looking for entertainment, he was looking for blueprints. He knew the Italians had tradition. They had hundreds of years of secret societies, of omerta, of structure. What did he have? He had the streets, he had the people, and he had a mind that worked like a clock mechanism, cold and precise. The Italians saw him, of course, but they didn't see him. They saw a colored gangster. They saw a roughneck who had come up from the bottom. They saw his size, his scars, the way he carried himself with a jagged edge. They mistook his silence for lack of intelligence. They mistook his patience for fear. One of the Genovese capos, a man named Vincent, was the first to make the mistake. Vincent was loud. He liked silk suits that shimmered under the streetlights and cars that took up 2 spaces. He looked at Harlem and saw a gold mine that was being mismanaged. He thought Bumpy was a relic, a placeholder. Vincent started small. He sent his runners into the fringe territories, East Harlem, pushing the line, just a block here, a storefront there. He didn't ask permission, he just took. Bumpy did nothing. The word on the street began to circulate, whispers in the barber shops. Is Bumpy losing his grip? Why is he letting them push him? Maybe the old man is tired. Bumpy heard the whispers. He felt the eyes on him when he walked into the barber shop, the sudden quiet that fell over the room. It stung, it burned his pride. But he swallowed it. He let the insult sit in his stomach like a stone, because he knew that to trap a predator, you have to offer it bait, and the best bait is the illusion of weakness. Vincent grew bolder. He started demanding a percentage of the policy banks on the east side. He sent 2 enforcers to collect. They walked into a counting house on 118th Street, kicked over a table, and told the clerk that from now on, 20% went to Vincent. Still, Bumpy did nothing. 3 weeks passed. The tension in Harlem was thick enough to choke on. His own lieutenants were getting restless. They wanted to hit back. They wanted to send a message. They came to him, guns tucked into their waistbands, eyes pleading for the order. Let us handle it, Bumpy. Let us show them. Bumpy sat in his chair, peeling an orange. He looked at them, his eyes flat and unreadable. Not yet, he said softly. Let him eat. Let him get full. What Bumpy knew and what Vincent didn't was that every dollar Vincent took was marked. Bumpy wasn't just watching, he was documenting. He was building a map of Vincent's operation based on where the money went. He saw who Vincent paid off, he saw who Vincent trusted, and most importantly, he saw who Vincent was hiding money from. The Mafia is a family, but it is a family of thieves, and in a family of thieves, the worst crime isn't murder, it's holding out on the boss. Vincent was greedy. Bumpy had calculated this. He knew that if he made it easy for Vincent to steal, Vincent would get sloppy. He would start keeping more of his share. He wouldn't kick up the full percentage to the head of the family downtown. It was a Tuesday when the trap snapped shut, but it didn't happen with a gunshot. Bumpy put on his coat. He didn't take a weapon. He told his driver to take him downtown, not to a warehouse or a back alley, but to a very specific Italian bakery in Greenwich Village. Neutral ground, but dangerous ground. A black man walking into that neighborhood, into that specific bakery, was a statement. He walked in. The conversation in the room died instantly. The air grew cold. Bumpy walked to the counter, ordered a coffee and a pastry, and sat down at a small table near the window. He waited. 10 minutes later, a senior consigliere of the Genovese family walked in. He stopped when he saw Bumpy. His hand twitched toward his coat. Bumpy didn't flinch. He just nodded at the empty chair across from him. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. The consigliere sat. He looked at Bumpy with a mixture of confusion and hostility. "You're a long way from home, Johnson." "I like the coffee," Bumpy said. He reached into his pocket. The consigliere stiffened, but Bumpy didn't pull out a knife. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. "What is this?" "That," Bumpy said, his voice low, "is a list of the collections from East Harlem for the last 2 months. The real numbers. And next to it, the numbers Vincent reported to you." The consigliere looked at the paper. He scanned the columns. His face didn't change, but his eyes went hard. The difference was significant. Thousands of dollars a week, money that belonged to the family, sitting in Vincent's pocket. "Why give this to me?" the consigliere asked, looking up. "Why not just kill him?" Bumpy took a sip of his coffee. "Because business is better when the books are balanced. I don't want a war. I want my neighborhood. You take care of your problem, I'll take care of mine. And from now on, the line stays where it is." He stood up, dropped a bill on the table for the coffee, and walked out. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. That night, Vincent disappeared. There were no headlines, no police investigation. His car was found parked near the docks, unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. The next morning, the enforcers who had kicked over the table on 118th Street came back. They didn't kick anything this time. They apologized to the clerk. They left an envelope with the money they had taken, plus interest. They walked out with their heads down. The ripples of that coffee meeting spread through the underworld like a shock wave. The Italians realized what had happened. Bumpy hadn't fought them. He had used their own rules to execute one of their own. He had turned the Mafia against itself. It changed the dynamic forever. The colored gangster was gone. In his place was a sovereign power, a man who could sit at the table with the 5 families, not as a servant, but as a peer. The streets of Harlem went quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of respect, the kind of respect you give to a dormant volcano. Years later, when the Young Turks would ask Bumpy about the time the Italians tried to take over, expecting a war story about shootouts and car chases, Bumpy would just smile, that slow, dangerous smile. "You don't fight a fire with fire," he would say, looking out at the streets he owned. "You fight it by taking away the air." That is the nature of true control. It isn't about how loud you can shout. It isn't about the violence you can inflict. It is about seeing the board. It is about knowing that your enemy's greed is a sharper weapon than your own blade. It is the patience to wait in the dark, lighting a cigarette while the world assumes you are burning. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.